A new poll shows just how fed up Americans really are with the Biden administration. You know what? You can't blame them. I mean, it really doesn't come as any kind of surprise here, right? Hello, everyone. Welcome to the program. I am Trish. It's so good to have you here on the Trish Regan Show. We're going to talk about that new poll. We're going to dig in a little bit. Plus, our economy is faltering. And there's new evidence today that you need to hear that really suggests we are in a recession that is unlikely to get better before it gets worse. Plus, all that may suddenly be catching up to the stock market in a really interesting way. It's like this cross section between culture, politics, and then just plain old capitalism that seems to be mattering all of a sudden. I mean, Americans, they aren't stupid. They know the economy's not doing so well. They're blaming the Biden administration. Well, Wall Street is also not so stupid. And they know that the wokeism that has been promoted nonstop with all of these companies actually doesn't mean as much as just, well, pure hard cash, right? In other words, if a company is fantastically politically correct, but isn't actually making any money, then that's not going to fly. Disney is the latest to get caught up in all of this. So I'm going to have the very latest on the activist investor pursuing Disney right now. Please make sure that you download the full version. You subscribe to the full version, audio version of this podcast on Apple. It's really important that you do that. So if you do nothing else today, go to Apple and look up the Trish Regan Show and subscribe to it. Portions of today's program are brought to you by Legacy Precious Metals. There's never been a better time to invest in precious metals than right now. So go to legacypminvestments.com for more. Again, legacypminvestments.com. You can get a free investing guide there. All right, let's talk first about this poll because, again, it shouldn't come as a surprise, but it's pretty darn awful. I mean, Americans are getting really angry, right? I think that's the conclusion of this NBC News poll, which has never quite shown a president in such a poor state. Americans really feel like things are not going well. In fact, 74% of the country now says that the U.S. is on the wrong track. Think about that. 74, just 21% of all adults here in the U.S. believe that the country is headed in the right direction. This number has actually never been over 70% for NBC News as long as they've been doing this data. And yet that's how bad it is now. I think a lot of Americans felt that Joe Biden was coming into office, anybody who voted for him, to help, quote unquote, repair things, right? So we were supposed to be more together, less divided. The economy, they figured, would still do just fine. Why wouldn't it, right? It had been doing just great until March 2020, but then it picked up and things were booming. Of course, there was a little inflation in there too, and some very irresponsible policy by our Federal Reserve, but things were booming. So people felt like we could continue on that track sort of forever. And they've come to the realization that's not the case. It's not the case. And thus they're frustrated. I think it's going to hurt Democrats as we go into the fall, only because you just can't keep lying to the American people. You can't sit there and tell them you're going to redefine the word recession like you're redefining everything else and not expect some pushback. Meanwhile, let's look at another data point that I think is important as you consider what's really happening in this economy right now. And this is a study that just came out of PwC, which is a consulting firm. And they basically went around a few weeks ago and asked all kinds of executives at major U.S. companies what their hiring plans were. 700 different U.S. executives, various industries. And the conclusion was that hiring is going to be pretty weak compared to what we had seen in the past. In fact, half of the respondents said that they were preparing to reduce headcount, or they already had. 52% have implemented hiring freezes, according to PwC. And on top of that, you've got nearly 50%, 46% of companies either dropping or reducing signing bonuses. Don't forget, remember, it was like so hard to find employees. And so employers were doing anything they could to get anybody in the door, including those signing bonuses. That has changed. And so as we face this increasingly tight job market, I mean, it's still not very tight yet, but it could increasingly become so. I think Americans are going to continue to want to point the finger at someone, right? They're looking at this and saying, how can this be? And they feel like the current administration and the policies of this administration are responsible. And by the way, I don't disagree. I think that the administration's policies have been pretty darn poor. And when you talk about printing more money with your quote unquote Inflationary Reduction Act that will actually result in more inflation, well, it shows you the problem we really have. I want to get to how this problem is being expanded onto Wall Street and specifically with some companies, including Disney. And by the way, I think this is a good thing. It's kind of a wake up call for companies that put too much emphasis on wokeness and not enough on actually making money. I mean, God forbid anybody actually make any money, right? You know, we just got to focus on keeping everybody happy. Of course, you do have shareholders you might want to keep happy. Anyway, we're going to get to that in just a second. But before I do, I think it's really important in light of some of the challenging times we're facing and these poor economic policies to think about joining forces with a group that cares so much about this, like you and I do. I know you do. And that's the folks over at AMAC. This is the Association for Mature American Citizens, amac.us/Regan. That's the URL. You should go to amac.us/Regan, my last name, Regan. They're working to make sure that you're not going to face massive inflation in the future like we're currently looking at now. They care about making sure this America is there for all of us, for future generations, and that we continue to have upward mobility and we continue to have this prosperity. So you can join with them. We've got more than 2 million people, 2.4 million people now as part of this group. So you're with a very like-minded group of people, 2.4 million Americans that care as much as you about preserving the country and our freedoms, including our prosperity and our economic freedom, free of inflation, at amac.us/Regan. It's $16 a year and you make it up, I promise, in all kinds of discounts, restaurants, hotels, travel, all sorts of travel. Also, cell phone plans, health insurance plans. They've got all kinds of discounts and guidance on all of that. So go to amac.us/Regan today and sign up or renew at the Association of Mature American Citizens. But back to Disney here for a minute. Third Point Capital is the activist investor involved, a gentleman by the name of Dan Loeb. And he's basically come out swinging and said, look, you know, Disney, you got to get it together. And the way you can get it together, he's actually given them a bit of a roadmap, is by spinning off ESPN because, well, ESPN is just sort of a different business, right? And by actually having a full purchase of Hulu. So he'd like them to do a little bit more. I'll quote from the letter that he recently sent Bob Chapek. He's the CEO of the company, took over for Bob Iger, saying that, quote, ESPN would have greater flexibility to pursue business initiatives that may be more difficult as part of Disney, such as sports betting. Good point. He also urged that the company, as I said, integrate streamer Hulu directly into Disney Plus and direct to consumer platforms. None of this is, you know, targeting wokeism per se, but the fact that Disney is now ripe for an activist investor to come in like this, I think speaks to the point that Disney has gotten off track, right? There's been something called ESG investing out there in the background for the last few years, and it's become increasingly relevant, increasingly important, where Wall Street investors feel like, okay, well, we can't invest in this particular company if it's not environmentally, socially, properly governed, right? ESG, meaning environmental, social governance. And so that's code word for woke. And so if you're not woke enough, well, you're not going to get the big money investing in you, right? That's the thinking and that's the theory. And so consequently, you've got CEOs saying, okay, we got to show the world how diverse we are. We got to show the world how much we care. And yet when it really comes down to it, I would just argue that what investors should really care about is how much money you're making. I mean, the other stuff is great. Don't get me wrong. I'm as altruistic as anyone else, and I want to make sure that I'm investing in a good, quote unquote, good company. But at what point does quote unquote good start to get corrupted in ways that are really more about politics than they are about the company themselves? I mean, don't forget, we are a capitalist nation. And I think there's been a capitalist incentive of sorts to be as PC as you possibly can be But in doing so, some of these companies have lost their way, and now the chickens are coming home to roost. In other words, now it's going to get more challenging because you have the Fed pulling back, right? So you don't have as much money printing, therefore you don't have as much inflation, you don't have as much craziness in the stock market. So people are going to start looking at things like fundamentals, and fundamentals matter. And I don't know where ESG is quite within the fundamentals scheme, right? If you're actually just saying, well, how much money is this company making? Are they really, bringing in over and over again their core customer base and able to profit from that customer base? If that's in question at all, now is the time that that's going to become increasingly an issue. So Disney's one example. And as I said, Dan Loeb from Third Point Capital, he's not saying that outright. I mean, he's just making the point about ESPN and Hulu. But I suspect that, behind all these layers is that fundamental issue of companies getting away from what they once did really well. That's the kind of stuff that you should be on the lookout for. It's the kind of thing that you want to be careful of as an investor if you've been investing in some of these things just because, they sounded good, just because it sounded like they had a good PR spin. That stuff isn't going to matter as much, especially as we go into this more challenging economic environment. Speaking of companies like Disney trying to put out content for politically correct reasons, it does show you that there's going to be many more opportunities, I think, even for smaller players within the content space. Content creators that can provide content that people do want to see and that they feel are aligned with their values, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to mention this movie. I talked about it on last week's show, but I wanted to mention again, it's a movie called Lifemark. And if you're looking for a movie to watch right now, I think this is one that is really worth taking a look at. It's from the Kendrick brothers and Kirk Cameron. Remember Kirk Cameron from that sitcom back when we were kids, Growing Pains? It is opening up in theaters on September 9th. It's a great story about a young man named David whose life is just turned upside down when his birth mother emerges, and everything changes because she's now wanting to meet the son that she only held once. And it's inspired by a true story. Lifemark is a really powerful reminder, I think, of how much one life can impact another. It's pro-family, it's pro-love, it's pro-forgiveness, it's pro-reconciliation, it's pro-new beginnings. So if you're looking for a movie to watch, you know what? This is one that I think you'd really enjoy. Lifemark. Go see it. It's in theaters actually nationwide beginning, as I said, September 9th. And you can actually get or reserve your tickets today at lifemarkmovie.com, lifemarkmovie.com. I think it's really important to support content and projects that we can identify with and that we can believe in. I think that it's important in that case to put your money where your mouth is. Anyway, wonderful to have you all here today. Do me the favor, subscribe to the channel on YouTube, on Rumble. You can come visit me over at Locals, trishregan.locals.com, and I will see you right back here tomorrow.